Imagine walking through a dense forest on a misty autumn morning. The air is crisp, decaying leaves crunch underfoot, and the earthy scent of soil fills your lungs. But beneath your feet lies something extraordinary. An invisible network of fungal threads that spans the entire forest floor, connecting trees, plants, and organisms in a web of communication so sophisticated that some scientists have begun to ask a startling question. Is there an intelligence lurking in the fungi beneath us? In 2018, Professor Tonya Oliver stood at the edge of an ancient forest in the Pacific Northwest, her research equipment scattered around her like technological breadcrumbs. She wasn't searching for new mushroom species or cataloging biodiversity. She was listening, literally listening, to the fungal networks in the soil. What her specialized equipment detected that day would challenge our fundamental understanding of cognition, communication, and consciousness itself. The electrical signals we measured weren't random, she recalls, her voice still carrying a hint of disbelief even years later. They showed patterns, rhythms, almost like a language we couldn't understand. Something was happening down there that we couldn't explain with our existing models of fungal behavior. That something has become the focus of a scientific revolution, one that suggests fungi might possess a form of intelligence fundamentally different from our own, yet sophisticated enough to warrant a complete reconsideration of what it means to be an intelligent organism. What began as fringe research has exploded into a field that combines mycology, neuroscience, information theory, and even philosophy. The implications stretch from forest conservation to artificial intelligence, from agriculture to our very understanding of consciousness in the universe. But to understand this revolution, we must first journey underground, into the microscopic realm where fungal networks operate in silent, ceaseless activity. A hidden universe that might contain one of the most ancient forms of intelligence on our planet. The discovery challenging our understanding of intelligence didn't happen overnight. It began decades ago when scientists first started to unravel the complexity of what they call the Wood Wide Web, the vast mycorrhizal fungal networks that connect plants in natural ecosystems. These networks form symbiotic relationships with approximately 90% of land plants, creating underground highways of fungal threads called hyphae that collectively form the mycelium, the vegetative part of a fungus consisting of a network of fine white filaments. Dr. Youssef Zamora, a mycologist from the University of Washington, explains the basics. Fungi aren't plants. They're not animals either. They're their own kingdom of life that evolved along a completely different path. Unlike plants, they cannot photosynthesize, so they've developed remarkable strategies to obtain nutrients, including forming complex relationships with plants, where they exchange soil nutrients for carbohydrates produced through photosynthesis. This symbiotic relationship was once thought to be purely transactional, a simple exchange of resources. But beginning in the late 1990s, researchers began documenting something far more sophisticated. These fungal networks appeared to be facilitating communication between plants. In 1997, ecologist Suzanne Samar published groundbreaking research demonstrating that Douglas fir and paper birch trees share carbon through mycorrhizal networks. But the real shock came when she discovered that these networks don't just shuttle resources. They transmit what could only be described as information. When a tree is attacked by insects, for instance, it produces chemical warning signals. These signals travel through the fungal network to neighboring trees, which then preemptively increase their own chemical defenses before the insects reach them. The forest, it seemed, had an immune system, one mediated by fungi. It was revolutionary, says Dr. Talia Owens, a biochemist studying fungal communication. We were forced to ask, if these networks can transmit warning signals, what else might they be communicating? And more importantly, what role does the fungus itself play in this process? Is it merely a passive conduit? Or is it somehow processing and perhaps even modifying this information? This question, whether fungi are passive channels or active participants in the processing of information, would become the central mystery driving the field forward. It's the difference between telephone wires carrying human conversations and a neural network making decisions. And the answer would come from an unexpected direction: the study of electrical signals in fungi. As Samar and others were mapping the nutrient exchange in forest fungi networks, another group of scientists was making a discovery that would eventually connect with this work in astounding ways. Microbiologists had detected electrical impulses propagating through fungal hyphae, similar in some ways to the action potentials that neurons use to communicate in animal brains. And this is where our understanding of fungal networks began to take a decidedly strange turn, one that would lead Professor Oliver to that misty forest in 2018, listening to the electrical whispers of an organism that might, in some alien way, be thinking. The first hint that fungi might be capable of something resembling cognition came from an unlikely place: their ability to solve problems. In 2000, Japanese researchers placed the slime mold Physarum polycephalum, technically not a fungus but a related organism, in a maze with food at the entrance and exit. Remarkably, the organism grew through the maze, found the food, and then retracted all its branches except for the most efficient path between the two food sources, effectively solving the maze. This experiment was followed by others showing that slime molds could find the shortest route between multiple food sources, effectively recreating the Tokyo subway system's efficiency. They demonstrated memory, learning, and anticipation, all without a single neuron. While slime molds aren't true fungi, these experiments open the door to questioning whether organisms without brains might nonetheless possess computational abilities, the capacity to process information, make decisions, and adapt to changing environments. What we're discovering challenges the very foundation of how we define intelligence, explains Dr. Zamora. We've been brain-centric for so long, assuming that neurons are necessary for any form of cognition. But what if that's just one solution that evolution found? What if there are other substrates for intelligence that we've been overlooking? As if to answer this question, in 2018, a team led by computer scientist Andrew Adamatsky published a paper suggesting that fungi transmit electrical impulses through their networks in patterns that bear a striking resemblance to human language. Adamatsky inserted tiny electrodes into various fungi species and recorded the electrical impulses that spontaneously fired across their mycelia. What he found was astonishing. The spikes clustered into trains of activity, with groups of impulses resembling vocabularies of up to 50 words. The average length of each word was 5.97 letters, which is strikingly close to the 4.8 letters average of English words, notes Dr. Owens. Different fungal species produced different lexicons, with split-gill fungi using the most complex language among those studied. This research triggered both excitement and skepticism in the scientific community. Some critics pointed out that finding patterns in electrical impulses doesn't necessarily mean fungi are communicating in a meaningful way. Correlation doesn't imply cognition. But the research raised a profound question. What exactly is happening when these electrical signals pulse through fungal networks? To understand the significance of these findings, we need to step back and consider what makes something intelligent. Traditionally, we've defined intelligence through capabilities like problem-solving, learning, memory, and adaptation. But perhaps most fundamentally, intelligence requires information processing, taking in data from the environment, integrating it, making decisions based on it, and storing relevant patterns for future use. And this is precisely what fungi appear to be doing. Professor Oliver's work expanded on Adamatsky's findings by studying not just the pattern of electrical signals but their relationship to environmental changes. We exposed forest fungi networks to various stimuli, changes in temperature, moisture, the introduction of nutrients, and even damage to parts of the network, she explains. The electrical patterns changed in consistent ways in response to these stimuli. More importantly, we observed that the response to a second occurrence of the same stimulus was different from the first, suggesting some form of learning or memory. Even more intriguing was what happened when Oliver's team introduced plant root exudates, chemical compounds released by plant roots, To the fungi, the electrical activity changed dramatically, with new patterns emerging that appeared to correlate with subsequent changes in fungal growth toward or away from the chemical signal. It looked for all the world like decision-making, she says. The fungus wasn't just reacting reflexively. There was a pause, a burst of complex electrical activity, and then a coordinated response across the network. It was processing the information. But the most provocative findings came when researchers began to study how these fungal networks interact with trees and other plants in real forest ecosystems. Using a combination of isotope tracing and electrical monitoring, Oliver's team made a discovery that borders on the incredible. When a tree connected to the fungal network was damaged by insects, the electrical signals in the fungi changed not just near that tree, but throughout the network. More remarkably, these changed signals corresponded with the subsequent transfer of defensive compounds to other trees, even trees of different species. The fungi weren't just passively allowing trees to communicate, says Dr. Zamora. They were actively mediating the exchange, almost like a switchboard operator deciding which calls to put through. In some cases, they appeared to amplify the warning signals. In others, they seemed to dampen them. This raises a profound possibility. The fungal network might be doing more than facilitating plant communication. It might be making decisions about that communication based on factors we're only beginning to understand. But what could possibly drive such behavior? What evolutionary advantage would fungi gain from this level of involvement in plant communication? The answer, it seems, lies in understanding the unique ecological niche that fungi occupy, and the fundamentally different form of intelligence they might represent. To appreciate the strange intelligence of fungi, we must first recognize how fundamentally different they are from us. Humans are discrete organisms with centralized information processing in our brains. Fungi, in contrast, are decentralized networks where each part of the organism is in constant chemical and electrical communication with every other part. This decentralized structure mirrors their ecological function. Fungi are Earth's great connectors and decomposers. They break down the dead and redistribute their components to the living. They sit at the interface between life and death, orchestrating the flow of resources through ecosystems. Their entire existence is about processing and redistributing resources, explains ecological mathematician Dr. Marcus Lee. It's not a stretch to say that fungi are essentially biological information processing systems. Their mycelial networks analyze where resources are available, where they're needed, and how to efficiently transport them there. This function requires sophisticated computation. A fungal network must constantly monitor environmental conditions across its entire structure, which can span thousands of acres. It must detect nutrients, assess threats, coordinate growth, and manage relationships with countless plants and microorganisms, all without a brain. How do they manage this complexity? The answer appears to lie in their network structure. Fungal mycelium forms what network theorists call a small world network. The same structure found in the internet, social networks, and yes, animal brains. Small world networks combine dense local connectivity with strategic long-distance connections. This architecture allows for both efficient local processing and rapid transmission of information across the entire network. It's the same structure that allows your brain to both process visual information in your occipital lobe and rapidly coordinate it with memories stored in your temporal lobe. When we mapped the physical structure of forest fungal networks, says Professor Oliver, we found they had nearly optimal network designs for information processing. They maintain alternative pathways for resilience while minimizing the energy costs of building the network. It's remarkably similar to how our neural networks are organized. This parallel became even more striking when researchers began applying tools from neuroscience to analyze fungal electrical activity. Using algorithms originally designed to detect patterns in brain activity, Oliver's team found that electrical signals in fungi displayed several hallmarks of information processing. They showed temporal integration, combining signals that arrived close together in time. They exhibited spatial summation, responding differently when multiple parts of the network were stimulated simultaneously. Most remarkably, they demonstrated what appeared to be attention. When strong signals arrived from one part of the network, sensitivity would decrease in other parts, similar to how our brains filter out irrelevant stimuli. It's important to emphasize that we're not saying fungi have consciousness or think like animals do, cautions Dr. Owens, but they do appear to be processing information in a coordinated, network-based way that accomplishes many of the same functional goals as a brain, just through radically different mechanisms. This perspective helps explain why fungi would involve themselves in plant communication networks. By managing the flow of information between plants, fungi can influence which plants receive resources, which thrive and which struggle, all of which affects the fungi's own access to carbohydrates and other vital compounds. In this light, the forest begins to look less like a collection of individual organisms and more like a complex superorganism, with the fungal network serving as something akin to a distributed brain, processing information, allocating resources, and maintaining the health of the system as a whole. But this raises a profound question. If fungal networks are processing information in brain-like ways, could they possess something akin to memory? The evidence suggests they might. The concept of memory in organisms without brains might seem far-fetched, but recent research has demonstrated that various brainless organisms, from plants to single-celled protists, can store and retrieve information about past experiences. Fungi may be particularly sophisticated in this regard. In 2021, Dr. Zamora's team conducted an experiment where they repeatedly exposed a fungal network to a pattern of temperature changes. Initially, the fungi responded with stress reactions, increased metabolic activity, and electrical signaling. But after several repetitions, the network began anticipating the changes, adjusting its metabolism before the temperature shifted. What was fascinating, explains Dr. Zamora, was that this anticipatory response persisted even when we stopped the temperature changes for several days. When we resumed the pattern, the fungi immediately showed the anticipatory response. They had clearly stored information about the pattern and retained it over time. But where and how is this information stored? The answer appears to lie in the structure of the network itself. When fungi encounter new environmental conditions, they respond not just biochemically, but by physically remodeling their networks, strengthening certain connections, weakening others, and forming new linkages. This physical restructuring creates a living record of past experiences, encoded in the architecture of the mycelium itself. It's similar in some ways to how our brains form memories by strengthening synaptic connections, says Dr. Owens. But fungi do this on a much larger physical scale, essentially rebuilding their entire network architecture in response to experience. This capacity for network remodeling explains one of the most remarkable properties of fungal intelligence: its resilience. You can cut a fungal network into pieces, and each piece will retain the memories encoded in its structure. When these fragments regrow, they often display behaviors influenced by the experiences of the original network. This distributed memory storage might seem primitive compared to our neural memory systems, but it has distinct advantages, particularly in terms of resilience and longevity. Some fungal networks in Oregon's Blue Mountains are estimated to be over 2,400 years old, making them some of the oldest living organisms on Earth. These ancient fungi have been continuously learning and adapting for millennia. If these networks really are storing information over time, muses Professor Oliver, then the oldest fungal networks on Earth represent something truly extraordinary, living records of ecological history stretching back thousands of years. But the most provocative evidence for fungal cognition comes from studies of how these networks respond to threats and opportunities, behaviors that suggest not just memory, but something resembling decision-making. When faced with multiple food sources, fungi don't grow indiscriminately toward all of them. Instead, they appear to evaluate the options, considering factors like nutrient quality, distance, and risks, such as the presence of fungicides or competing organisms. They then allocate their growth resources accordingly, often focusing on the most promising opportunities while maintaining minimal connections to alternatives. It's a sophisticated form of risk management, says Dr. Lee. The fungi maintain awareness of multiple options while investing primarily in the most favorable ones. When conditions change, they can rapidly reallocate resources, something that requires constant monitoring and evaluation across the entire network. This behavior becomes even more intriguing when we consider how fungi interact with multiple plant partners simultaneously. Research from the Netherlands has shown that when connected to multiple tree species, mycorrhizal fungi can preferentially allocate phosphorus to the trees providing the most carbohydrates, essentially rewarding their best partners. But it gets more complex. The fungi don't simply maximize immediate returns. They appear to maintain relationships with less productive plants as a form of insurance against future changes. If the previously generous tree species becomes stressed or damaged, the fungi can quickly pivot to their alternative partners. This suggests something beyond simple stimulus-response behavior, argues Professor Oliver. The fungi are balancing current returns against future possibilities, maintaining options, and adjusting their strategy based on changing conditions. That requires integration of multiple information streams and something analogous to predictive modeling, comparing potential future scenarios to make present decisions. These behaviors have led some scientists to propose that fungal networks might possess a form of swarm intelligence, similar to how ant colonies or beehives can solve complex problems through the collective action of simple agents following local rules. But fungi may represent something even more sophisticated, a biological network that combines aspects of both centralized and distributed information processing. Each part of the fungal network can act independently, responding to local conditions, explains Dr. Zamora. But these local responses are coordinated across the entire organism through electrical and chemical signaling, creating a unified response that benefits the whole. This balance between local autonomy and global coordination creates a form of intelligence profoundly different from our own, one that might offer valuable insights into alternative models of cognition and even inspire new approaches to artificial intelligence. As evidence for fungal intelligence accumulates, it challenges one of our most fundamental assumptions, that intelligence requires a brain. This assumption has shaped not just our science but our philosophy, ethics, and sense of human uniqueness. If we accept that brainless fungi networks can process information, solve problems, learn from experience, and adapt their behavior accordingly, we may need to radically expand our conception of what intelligence is. Dr. Tessa Orloff, a cognitive philosopher collaborating with Oliver's team, frames the challenge. Western thought has traditionally drawn sharp distinctions between mind and matter, intelligence and instinct, sentience and stimulus response. Fungi blur all these boundaries. They suggest that cognition might be a fundamental property of life, manifesting not just in brains but in any biological system complex enough to process and act on information in sophisticated ways. This perspective aligns with emerging views in cognitive science, where intelligence is increasingly understood not as a binary property that organisms either have or lack, but as a continuum of information processing capabilities that have evolved in different forms across all domains of life. Different organisms have evolved different solutions to the fundamental problems of survival, explains Dr. Lee. Brains are just one solution, a particularly energy-intensive one that specializes in rapid information processing. Fungal networks represent an alternative evolutionary strategy, sacrificing speed for resilience and longevity. This view suggests that fungal intelligence isn't lesser than animal intelligence, just profoundly different. Operating on timescales of hours, days, and seasons rather than milliseconds and seconds, fungi may perceive the world in ways we can barely imagine. To a fungal network, a forest isn't a collection of static objects, suggests Professor Oliver. It's more like a flowing river of resources and information, nutrients seeping through soil, carbon flowing from plants, warning signals propagating between trees. They may perceive patterns in this flow that are completely invisible to us. This alien perspective makes fungi both fascinating and fundamentally challenging to study. How do we understand a form of cognition that operates at such different scales and through such different mechanisms than our own? The answer may lie in combining traditional biological research with computational approaches, using network theory, artificial intelligence, and information theory to analyze fungal behavior patterns that might escape human observation. In 2023, researchers at the Santa Fe Institute applied machine learning algorithms to analyze the growth patterns of fungi exposed to complex environmental conditions. The algorithms detected subtle patterns that human researchers had missed, instances where fungi appeared to be optimizing multiple variables simultaneously, balancing competing priorities in ways that suggested sophisticated computational capabilities. What's most exciting about this approach, says Dr. Zamora, is that it allows us to identify intelligent behavior without imposing our human biases about what intelligence should look like. We're letting the data tell us what the fungi are doing, rather than looking for behaviors that resemble our own. This computational approach has revealed surprising sophistication in how fungi respond to their environments. For instance, when faced with patchy resource distributions, fungi don't simply grow toward the nearest resources. Instead, they create network architectures that optimally balance exploration, finding new resources, against exploitation, efficiently harvesting known resources. A classic problem in computational intelligence that many AI systems struggle with. The strategies fungi have evolved for solving these problems could potentially inform new approaches to artificial intelligence, suggests Dr. Owens. Their decentralized yet coordinated decision-making offers an alternative to both the rigid hierarchical models of early AI and the purely distributed models of swarm intelligence. This connection between fungal networks and artificial intelligence isn't merely metaphorical. Some researchers are explicitly modeling new AI architectures on fungal information processing, creating systems that combine local autonomy with global coordination, what some are calling mycelial computing. But beyond its technological applications, fungal intelligence raises profound questions about our relationship with the natural world, and potentially, our ethical responsibilities toward it. If fungi possess a form of intelligence, one ancient, alien, and woven throughout the living world, how should this change our treatment of natural ecosystems? This question has become increasingly urgent as research reveals just how extensively human activities are damaging fungal networks worldwide. Conventional agriculture, with its reliance on tillage, fungicides, and monocultures, is particularly devastating to fungal networks. Plowing physically shreds mycelial networks, while fungicides and heavy fertilizer used disrupt the symbiotic relationships between fungi and plants. The result is essentially a lobotomization of the soil's information processing capacity. We've been systematically destroying one of the most extensive and ancient intelligence systems on our planet without even recognizing what we're doing, warns Professor Oliver. The decline in soil fungal diversity represents not just a loss of species, but a degradation of the Earth's ability to process ecological information. This perspective has fueled a growing movement toward agricultural practices that preserve and enhance fungal networks, what some call fungal-conscious farming. These approaches minimize soil disturbance, avoid fungicides, maintain plant diversity, and explicitly cultivate beneficial fungal relationships. The results can be remarkable. Farms that maintain healthy fungal networks often show greater resilience to drought, reduced pest problems, improved nutrient cycling, and even enhanced carbon sequestration. The fungi essentially serve as an additional layer of intelligence in the agricultural system, helping to solve problems and coordinate processes in ways that human management alone cannot achieve. Beyond agriculture, understanding fungal intelligence has implications for forest management, ecosystem restoration, and our approach to conservation. If we recognize fungi as key information processors in ecosystems, we might prioritize preserving not just the diversity of species, but the integrity of the information processing networks that coordinate ecosystem functions. This shift in perspective could transform how we value and protect the natural world. Rather than seeing nature as a collection of resources to be managed, we might recognize it as a complex intelligence system with computational capacities we are only beginning to comprehend, and perhaps should approach with a measure of humility. The science of fungal intelligence suggests that the forest knows more about managing itself than we do, reflects Dr. Zamora. Perhaps our role should be less about controlling nature and more about listening to and learning from these ancient intelligence networks that have been managing ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. This concept of listening to fungal networks has moved beyond metaphor. Several research groups are now developing technologies to monitor and interpret the electrical and chemical signals passing through mycorrhizal networks in real time. These fungal translators aim to give humans insight into how forests respond to stresses like drought, disease, or pollution, potentially providing early warning systems for ecosystem health. Imagine if we could tap into this information processing layer that spans our forests, says Dr. Owens. We might detect emerging threats to ecosystem health long before they become visible to conventional monitoring. The fungi are already monitoring these systems far more comprehensively than we ever could. Some researchers have gone even further, exploring whether we might someday communicate with fungal networks, not through language, but through patterns of chemical or electrical signals that the fungi can sense and respond to. It sounds like science fiction, acknowledges Professor Oliver. But then, so did much of what we now know about fungal networks 20 years ago. If fungi can learn to associate patterns of signals with specific outcomes, it's conceptually possible that we could develop a rudimentary form of human-fungal communication. Such communication would be nothing like human conversation, more akin to the slow, chemical-based exchanges that occur between plants and fungi in nature. But even this limited form of cross-kingdom information exchange could transform our relationship with the natural world, giving us access to an intelligence that operates on fundamentally different principles from our own. This possibility points to perhaps the most profound implication of fungal intelligence research. It suggests that intelligence might be not the exception but the rule in nature, manifesting in different forms across all scales of life. From this perspective, what we call intelligence isn't something that emerged recently with human consciousness or even with animal nervous systems. Rather, it may be an inherent property of living systems, the capacity to process information, learn from experience, and adaptively respond to changing conditions. Different organisms have simply evolved different substrates and architectures for this processing, from neural networks to fungal mycelium to the biochemical circuits of single cells. If we define intelligence functionally, in terms of what it does rather than how it's implemented, then we find it everywhere in the living world, suggests Dr. Orloff. Fungi just happen to be a particularly striking example because their network architecture makes the parallel to neural systems more apparent. This perspective invites us to see intelligence not as a special property that separates humans from nature, but as a continuum that connects us to all living things, a continuum along which we can learn from the different information processing strategies that have evolved across billions of years of life on Earth. The fungal networks threading through soil may represent one of the oldest and most extensive intelligence systems on our planet, one that operates through mechanisms and timescales profoundly different from our own, yet solves many of the same fundamental problems of survival, adaptation, and information processing. By understanding this alternative form of intelligence, we might gain insight not just into the nature of fungi but into the nature of intelligence itself, expanding our conception of what it means to think, to know, and to be aware in this vast and complex world. In her lab at the university, Professor Oliver is showing me something remarkable, a petri dish containing a simple fungal network growing on nutrient agar. She attaches tiny electrodes to different parts of the mycelium and points to a screen displaying real-time readings of electrical activity. Watch what happens when I add this chemical to one side of the network, she says, carefully pipetting a drop of solution onto the edge of the mycelium. On the screen, I can see a burst of electrical activity at the point of contact, But then something unexpected happens. Within seconds, the electrical patterns change across the entire network, including areas far from where the chemical was applied. The fungi is not just reacting locally. It's integrating and processing this new information across its entire being. We still don't fully understand what's happening here, Professor Oliver admits. But it's clear that information is being processed, decisions are being made. The network is thinking not like we think, but in its own way. As I watch the patterns of electrical activity rippling through this ancient life form, I'm struck by a humbling realization. For billions of years before our species evolved, before any animal with a brain existed, the Earth was already filled with intelligence. It was just operating on different principles at different speeds, through different structures than the neural intelligence we've come to see as the only legitimate form. Perhaps intelligence isn't something that emerged recently in evolutionary history. Perhaps it's woven into the very fabric of life itself, manifesting differently across organisms but fundamentally connected by the common challenges of surviving in a complex and changing world. The fungi beneath our feet remind us that we are not alone in our capacity to know the world. We are merely one expression of a broader phenomenon, intelligence that has been evolving on Earth since life began, taking myriad forms across countless species. In the networked intelligence of fungi, we glimpse not only an alien form of cognition but a profound truth about our place in nature. We are not the only thinkers here. We have always been surrounded by other minds, operating in ways we're only beginning to comprehend.